back to Your Next Episode. Today, our topic is hormones and the massive part they have to play on our mental health. And my guest is Diane Danzebrink. Diane is a psychotherapist, a menopause expert, wellbeing consultant, and she tirelessly campaigns for improved care and support for menopausal women, having personally had a dreadful experience of the menopause herself. Diane is changing the menopause landscape, really, for me and you and our daughters, and she's always a joy to talk to, so I'm delighted to have the chance to do so again today. Welcome, Diane.
Morning, lovely. How are you?
Hello. Good, thank you. We're recording remotely during week 8, I think it is, of the coronavirus lockdown. And how are you doing, Diane? How's your lockdown going?
Absolutely fine, lovely. To be honest, it's actually it's a relatively normal situation for me, because I do, apart from when I go off to, sort of present to organisations or when I go off to give talks, etc., a lot of my sort of private therapy work, a lot of the work that I do with menopause support is done remotely. So right. I'm used to spending a lot of my day sitting in front of a screen doing video consultations with people. So actually, It's not that different for me, to be perfectly honest.
No, okay. Oh, good. Oh, that's okay then. So, we're all sort of getting to. I do a lot of work from home, but sort of getting to grips with doing the podcast remotely has been a bit challenging for me. But
thank goodness for technical backup.
I know. Okay, as I said, today we're focusing on hormones and mental health. Now, contrary to popular belief, menopause doesn't just happen to women in their 50s. Perimenopause typically begins in early 40s, and often women don't have hot flushes, which seems to be the main indicator that people think of. And symptoms are more likely to be psychological, aren't they? Can you run us through those?
Yeah, sure.
Symptoms?
I mean, that's absolutely true. Sort of if we're talking about a natural menopause, and what I mean by that is the, sort of the ovarian function changing and the hormone levels starting to fluctuate, without any surgical or medical intervention, then very often it is, sometimes late 30s, early 40s, that these first symptoms start to happen. Obviously, if we may have women who go into menopause even earlier, which is premature ovarian insufficiency, and that would be women under 40. And of course, that happens to approximately 1 in 100 women under 40. But as far as the symptoms are concerned, the sort of psychological and cognitive symptoms are generally, without a doubt, the one that I hear the most regularly is anxiety. Low moods, what people might describe as feeling depressed. Things like struggling with memory, struggling with concentration, reduced confidence because of those things, irritability, mood swings, etc., etc. So there's a host of them. But unfortunately, because we as individuals, because we as women, and men too, none of us are currently taught anything about menopause, it's quite difficult to recognise if there are no hot flushes, if periods haven't started to change. Very often people don't put 2 and 2 together.
No. And, for me now, obviously I'm very aware of all of that, and lots of the people I, work with or, friends of mine are aware of those symptoms. But it's still, actually, most people aren't aware of them. It's quite often is very apparent to me that, oh, hang on, I'm in a bit of a bubble where everyone knows about the menopause.
Yeah.
Generally, people don't, do they? So
no, they don't. And I think it's also fair to say that for the vast majority of people, they've never heard the term perimenopause either. So perimenopause is essentially everything from your first symptom to the time when you have had 12 months without a period. And that can be, sort of on average between about 4 and 8 years of a woman's life. But most people have never heard the term perimenopause. And, stereotypically, we still generally, if you were to go out on the street and ask people and say what was menopause, they would probably say hot flushes and period stopping.
Yeah.
But, there are I think everybody sort of within the world of menopause would agree that there are 30 plus symptoms. Depending on what list you look at, you might see a few variables, but there are lots of symptoms, and for a lot of women, it's these psychological symptoms that come about first. And of
Yeah.
course, the difficulty with that is that if we don't recognize them as to do with perimenopause, the questions that sort of go through people's minds are things like, well, what's wrong with me? There's nothing going on in my life. I don't understand why this is happening. Some people will say things, probably one of the most common things I hear on a day-to-day basis is, I think I'm going mad.
Yes.
And of course, if we don't recognize it, what happens is that just piles on the anxiety, that compounds the situation, makes it worse. And then, of course, for a lot of women, their first port of call will be their doctor. So they'll go with these symptoms, all the things, we mentioned earlier, anxiety, low mood. They might say they feel depressed, etc. And unfortunately, the sort of the common management that they'll be prescribed is they'll be offered antidepressants. And of course, if you're not depressed, antidepressants is not appropriate. And antidepressants are certainly not first-line treatment for menopause symptoms, because essentially what's happening is the hormones are fluctuating and we're into a state of estrogen deficiency.
Yeah, right. So the psychological symptoms, it is all down to hormones. What is going on then hormonally?
Yeah, so when we're talking about the hormones, we're talking about estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. But the protagonist for the vast majority of symptoms is the fluctuating and eventually the falling levels of estrogen. So if we sort of think about a woman's body, we have estrogen receptors all over the body, literally from the top of your head to the tip of your toes. Estrogen is such a vital hormone, and it does so many different things. So if we were to light up a woman, she would light up a bit like a Christmas tree with all those, those beautiful twinkly fairy lights where her estrogen receptors are, because they're everywhere. So what happens is the brain is really dense. It's packed with estrogen receptors. So estrogen is very helpful in supporting our serotonin levels. So serotonin, more commonly known as the happy hormone. So when estrogen levels start to fluctuate, then consequently your serotonin level is not being supported. It also helps with what's called neuroreception. So essentially that's how effectively the messages get from one part of the brain to the other. So when people start to talk about cognitive dysfunction, things like memory, concentration, that's because the estrogen levels are fluctuating. And of course, some days can definitely be better than others. But that's also really confusing if you don't know what's going on, because if you think about it, the estrogen levels will be peaking and dipping. They won't be, we're not talking about, sort of the kind of cycle that we would have had previously. They're sort of going all over the place. It's probably important, Louise, to say at this point that 1 in 4 women will have almost no symptoms at all, but 3 out of 4 will, and 1 in 4 will have what are described as debilitating symptoms. So, really quite seriously affecting their quality of life in some way, shape, or form.
Psychological symptoms, you mean?
Symptoms altogether.
Right, okay.
Any group of symptoms. But I think the important thing to say is that the psychological symptoms certainly seem to be the first that most women who are experiencing symptoms, when they can look back retrospectively, because very often menopause is a retrospective experience. It's not until you look back to sort of your late 30s, early 40s that you can start to put the pieces together and understand why you were feeling more anxious, why you were feeling, sort of flat and low, etc., etc., etc. And, it's a really, really tricky thing. And it's so sad because all for a little bit of basic information, what's happening is there are so many women, not just around the country, but around the world, struggling with these symptoms and feeling really, again, one of the really common things I hear is, I feel so alone. I feel like it's just me. I've lost myself. I don't know who I am. And it's, it's so sad because you and I have spoken about this before, but it is such a complete no-brainer for me. 50% of the population are going to experience menopause directly. So if you say 75% of them are going to have symptoms, seriously, would it not be more sensible for us to prime that 50% and inform the other 50% that
of course,
if this is happening to somebody that you know or love, maybe you could mention to them or point them in the direction of, do you know what, this is what it might be. This could be menopause.
Yeah, just to come in there about your Make Menopause Matter campaign, that's what that is all about. You created that to improve menopause education amongst doctors as well, and raise awareness of the menopause. I know that you would. If someone was to say, oh, well, that doesn't really concern me, menopause isn't something I need to worry about, they're wrong, aren't they? It pretty much, it concerns all of us, really.
It does concern all of us because, essentially the three aims of the campaign are to ensure that GPs have mandatory education about menopause, because sadly at the moment they don't. To ensure that we have greater support in the workplace, because there's a lot of misunderstanding there too. And also, I'm delighted to say that having launched the campaign towards the end of 2018, in July 19, it was confirmed by the government that menopause will now be taught in the new RSE curriculum in schools in England from September this year. Now, that is only England, so I'm really hoping that, those in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland will follow suit. But it absolutely concerns everybody, because if you think about it, okay, it's going to affect women directly. It's definitely going to have an impact on partners, on family members. For some, it will possibly have an impact in the workplace. We all have mothers, aunties, grandmothers, sisters, cousins, children, etc., etc. So there is not a person on the planet who is not going to, in some way, shape or form, come into contact with a menopausal woman at some point in their lives. They might not realise it, but if they had the information, we could end a lot of the needless suffering that's going on.
So are all women affected in the same way by this hormone fluctuation?
Well, interestingly, no, because, as I say, 1 in 4 will experience almost no symptoms, but 3 out of 4 will. And if I'm really honest with you, that's not completely understood. And part of the reason that that's not completely understood is because there has been, such a lack of study around, well, in women's health, full stop, but let's not get started on that. But definitely in menopause. But what is really exciting is that over in the States, there are a couple of neuroscientists. I'm sure there are more, but there are a couple who, are quite well known, who are doing a lot of work on essentially the female brain. and hormones. So there's a lady called Roberta Diaz-Brinton who's been working on this for many years, and more recently Lisa Mosconi. So Lisa's got a book coming out. It was supposed to come out here this year. It's now been postponed till next year, called XX, which is all about how hormones affect female brain function. So there's definitely stuff happening, which is really exciting. We're probably talking 20 years before we know sort of the details and sort of how the research is going to pan out. But it's so exciting to know that sort of there is now some focus on this.
Yeah, and of course it sounds like it's just women. Is it just women researching it?
Oh, I'm sure there are wonderful men in their teams too. But these are definitely kind of a couple of the leading lights in this area.
Yeah, okay. Just thinking about, a woman who, is being affected by those hormones, and then you add into the mix outside factors of life, relationship issues, dealing with children, teenagers, unwell parents, work, etc. Is communication with those around you really important then, would you say?
I think communication, full stop, in any relationship is the most important thing that we can have. I think what makes it difficult is that this kind of general lack of understanding. So if the woman herself doesn't understand, if those around her don't understand, I think it's difficult to know what to communicate, because for some people, just communicating, I don't feel like me, but I don't understand why, that can be quite a tricky thing to do. And I always encourage the women that I work with and the couples and I have to say, I've been absolutely thrilled to work with a few men recently.
Yeah, I was going to say, you do sort of you see couples together around this, don't you?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, quite often I'll get an email from a male partner who will say, I don't know what's going on with my wife, but I think it could be this, and could you help her? And obviously, then that has to be the woman herself has to, contact to say that she would like some help. But sometimes they do decide, they say, can we sit in on the session together? Which is really nice. But I've also had a handful over the past few months. I've had a handful of men get in contact to say, I would like to have a session with you so that I can understand how I can better support my partner.
How marvellous.
Which but it just shows that we're actually moving forward, that things are starting to change. So that's really important. But I think around communication, it's tricky, isn't it? Because there are a whole host of relationships. We might be talking about partners, whether we're, whether we're in a partnership with a man or a woman. We might be talking about partnerships. And of course, same-sex relationships can also prove to be tricky, because just because it's two women doesn't mean that you both get it, doesn't mean that you both understand, because if one of you is experiencing menopause before the other, or if you experience it completely differently, then it still doesn't mean, just because it's another woman, doesn't mean that you have understanding.
No, because as we were saying earlier, even, as women ourselves, we haven't heard of perimenopause. It's not something we have an innate knowledge of, that we just go, aha, this is what, we're walking through, lots of women just walking through this completely clueless themselves,
Exactly, lovely. I mean, I had an occasion, it was a few months ago now, where a woman got in contact and asked if she could, have a video session. And we started the session, and about halfway through, this voice piped up in the background, and it was another female voice. And she said, actually, can I come and sit in too? Because now you're going through the symptoms. I think this might be happening to me too. And this was the two partners. And it was just, it's just amazing that two women, one of them who had recognised she might be having symptoms, living with another woman who hadn't recognised her symptoms at all. So, as I say, Louise, you and I have talked about this before, but there is so much work to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Just thinking about therapy, though, if somebody decides to see somebody like you, I mean, I would imagine that it actually probably is really important to find a therapist who understands menopause and the possible effects of hormone fluctuation. And I know you've spoken to other therapists before, haven't you, about explaining, to try and get that understanding out there. So it must be important that a therapist understands about the menopause. Otherwise, we're going back to that dishing out antidepressants.
Yeah. So again, sort of it comes back to education. So, sort of certainly from my experience and what I've seen, hormones is not a part generally of therapy education. I'm well aware that a lot of psychiatrists have very little knowledge about menopause and hormones. But I think it is really important. Yeah, I spoke at the BACP conference last year to about 300 therapists about it. And what was really interesting about that is that at the end of the session, there was a big queue, but it wasn't really people to talk to me about how they were going to work with their clients. It was more about, oh my goodness, a light bulb's just gone off for me while you've been speaking, and actually this is me. So I now teach a course to therapists about menopause. But I think, it is important, Louise, because it depends what you're looking for as well. So, sort of via Menopause Support, which is the not-for-profit organisation that I set up around this, I do these one-off one-to-ones, which is really people talking more about their symptoms, how they can manage them, and then I write a letter to their doctor, hopefully kind of easing the way into them getting the right advice and support. Outside of that, sort of I do a lot of therapy, kind of for me, basically, I like to be common sense about these things. It's really just having somebody to talk to who understands and can help you to move through. But that's very much more about probably the sort of the transition, what you were talking about all the outside factors. And menopause can definitely be a really transitional time of life. It is it is a point to pause where you can look at what life's been like before, what it's like now, potentially, sort of at 50, 51, whatever age it comes along. As I say, for some, it's much earlier. What do I want the rest of my life to look like? How do I kind of sort the dirty washing of today, whatever that might be, whether it's relationships, work, children, parents, etc., etc. So that's, that's something that is probably done over several sessions. But I think it is key that somebody understands the complexities of menopause and the fact that it can be quite a pivotal time in a woman's life.
So for a woman who might be having light bulb moments listening to this, like you just talked about just now, what can she do? What would you say if a woman's listening and going, that's how I feel, I'm anxious, or all of those things.
Yep.
Where does she go? What does she do now?
Okay, so the first thing I would say is if you go to the Menopause Support website, which is menopausesupport.co.uk, you'll find lots of free resources there. So if you go to the resources section, you'll find things like a symptom checker that you can print off and you can complete, and that will kind of give you maybe a bit more of an idea of just how many of those symptoms you might be struggling with. There are things like my lovely friend Jane Lewis who's written the book Me and My Menopausal Vagina, has written a guide for us all about vaginal atrophy. Another friend, the lovely Sam Evans, has written a guide about basically sex and the menopause. There's a guide that I've written about menopause and relationships, which is really written for partners. So it's something for women to be able to give to their partners so that they can understand it a little bit better. And then I would say you need to think about how would you like to manage your menopause symptoms? So, for me, this should all be about informed choice. But I think the important thing is that the information is factual, non-biased, and evidence-based. So I think, I would look at things like the British Menopause Society. Another lovely friend, Dr. Newson, has a great information website called Menopause Doctor. So there's lots of good, there's lots of good factual info out there that you can make use of. I run something called the Menopause Support Network on Facebook, which is a huge now support group. We've now got 13,500 members.
Wow.
I'm blessed with the most amazing team of women who volunteer to moderate that for me on a daily basis while I do things like this and work. But again, they're now a very educated group of women, because essentially they've all learnt things from me and from other people on the group who are knowledgeable. They now are very generous in passing that knowledge on. It's a very, very supportive group. So I would say come and join there.
I'll be coming along to that.
And
Didn't know that was there.
And then have a think about, if you would like to talk to your doctor about what your doctor can prescribe. So obviously, first line treatment for menopause symptoms is HRT, hormone replacement therapy. Really important to know that you've probably heard lots and lots of scary myths about HRT. Really important to say that the vast majority of HRT that is available in the UK is what we call body identical plant derived. So derived from the root vegetable, the yam. And we also have a body identical progesterone called Utrogestan, which is also plant derived. So if you had a patch, a gel, or we now have a new estrogen spray called Lenzetto. If you have one of those as your estrogen, and then your progesterone is this product called Utrogestan, that would give you a totally body identical plant derived prescription. And essentially, body identical simply means that the molecular structure of the hormone is exactly the same as the molecular structure of the hormones that you produce naturally. So the body recognizes them, and far fewer side effects. And I think, the kind of bottom line is the right dose of the right product for the right woman has huge benefits, and is generally very safe. Now, obviously, there are, there are slight caveats to that, depending upon your own and your family history. But you should be able to talk to your GP about those.
But really worth getting informed with that evidence-based information, because otherwise you're just relying on like 20-year-old, flawed research that the papers just keep banging out, because it's like it makes exciting headlines basically, and what the Daily Mail headline isn't evidence-based information, and that's what people need to sort of understand, I think, and get a little bit informed, don't they?
Yeah, that's absolutely true, Louise. I mean, that, the study that you're referring to, really has done a huge amount of damage, because not only have some of the key investigators of that study, pretty roundly, trashed it, but it's also fair to say that we have an awful lot of women who either were taken off of their HRT, or they decided to flush it down the loo at the time of that, at the time that those press releases were coming out, which is totally understandable. But of course, when they've stopped their HRT and not carried on with it, we know that hormones, estrogen specifically, is not just about alleviating symptoms. It's also about helping to protect our long-term health. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Bones, hearts, brains, particularly. So I think, if you're thinking, listening to this, or do you know what, I think I could have some of those symptoms, I would say, use some of those resources. get some sort of evidence-based information so that you can make some informed choices.
Absolutely. And I'll put all of those resources up on the show notes for this episode so people can go and look them up. Something else I wanted to ask is a woman more likely to experience worse psychological symptoms if she has suffered in the past with mental health problems, or if she's had historically really bad PMT, or if she had postnatal depression?
Yeah, really interesting. So it's a tricky one because mental health problems, that umbrella covers such a wide, such a wide gamut of issues. And I'll be really honest with you, and we won't go into it now because we'll be here for the rest of the day. But I do also think that there is, there certainly has been. Hopefully, we're sort of starting to think about it a little bit more now. I do think that there has been an awful lot of over-medicalisation of the human condition as far as mental health is concerned. The idea of doling out antidepressants to people who are bereaved.
Because that's not
bereavement.
It's very different to being sad because something terrible has happened.
Yeah.
To being depressed, which I assume is a continuous thing.
Well, I think it's another area, Louise, where there is still amongst real professionals in this area, there is still such a huge debate raging about the efficacy of antidepressants as a group of medicines anyway. But I think the important thing to say here is that if you have struggled with PMT, or what some will know as PMDD, which is premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So PMDD, again, newspaper headlines get it wrong. It is not a hormone imbalance. PMDD is having a sort of hypersensitivity to your normal fluctuating hormones, but you are incredibly sensitive to it. So if you've suffered with either of those, or you've ever had postnatal depression, it is a possibility that your perimenopause will be tricky, because we're talking again about hormone fluctuations. So I don't know if you've come across it, but there is a gynecologist who has now retired, really well-known gynecologist in the area of menopause, a guy called John Studd, wrote a paper many, many years ago about postnatal depression and the sort of drastic drop in estrogen, and whether what we should actually be doing is supplementing those women who had just given birth with estrogen at that time to help with that. That has never been taken up widely. For me, it's a bit of a no-brainer. It's a totally common sense thing to do. If your estrogen levels fallen through the floor, then surely what you need to do is temporarily, while the body, sort of comes back to some kind of balance, is to help it by But instead we dole out antidepressants. But I think
it's a really complex. I'm just sitting here now, just got my whole head's going off on a spin of
honestly, lovely. I'm currently doing the research for a book all about this, and my head's spinning too.
Oh, I bet.
But I think when we're talking about hormones are powerful things. If you have been identified as somebody who has suffered with hormone fluctuation in any way, shape or form in the past, then it is important when you go to speak to your doctor about this that you flag that up to them, because obviously it might not be the same doctor. You might have moved, your doctor might have changed, etc. But, sort of hormones are powerful, and it can make the saddest thing for me is, I've certainly worked in the last few months with several women, couple in their 50s, actually some who are significantly younger, who have been undiagnosed with PMDD. And PMDD can have huge, sort of effects on your life. It can,
God, I
it
could
can
bet, yeah.
it can put you in bed for days at a time. It can make you manic. It can have a huge effect on your quality of life, on your relationships, on your ability to hold down a job. And again, it's another area that we desperately need, we really desperately need to have more information about, more research about. If anybody's listening and they're thinking, oh my goodness, I think that might be me, I would signpost you to a brilliant patient-led site, which is called Vicious Cycle. Again, a lovely friend of mine, a lady called Laura Murphy, is very much involved with that. But they're a brilliant patient-led organisation who can signpost you to all sorts of information.
Listening to you just then talking about that and thinking about, friends of mine who in their 30s, I now look back and think, I bet, who were just like that, like would have days where they couldn't get out of bed, and you think, oh God, she's being pathetic. I mean, this is sort of 20 years ago. And then manic periods and, it's just not very well understood, is it?
I think the current figures from the, from the small pieces of research we have, I think the current figures say that we think that around 1 in 20 women experience this.
Wow.
It's massive.
Wow. Thinking about younger women, I'd just like to ask, my last question is about lots of our listeners have teenagers. So can you, I don't know, I know it's not, maybe not your area, I'm not sure, but can you explain what's going on for them as regards hormones and how, that might impact their behaviour and also their mental health?
Yeah.
And is there what support as parents, or is there medical support? What should we be doing to help them that might be beneficial for them?
Again, Louise, we're going to come back to my same old broken record about lack of education, lack of research, lack of information, essentially. So essentially, kind of when in puberty, in our teenage years, the hormones are really just getting going. They're really kind of starting to kick in. And essentially, I often hear people talk about, kind of sulky teenagers, kind of the sort of rages that can happen, et cetera. But if you think about it, if you're 15, 16, 17, and you've got no idea what's going on, you've got no idea what's happening. And then as a parent, so imagine you've got that combined with a perimenopausal woman who's got, and I know this is going on all over the country, who's also got absolutely no idea what's going on. I mean, imagine what that must be like. But I think particularly for teenagers, it can be really tough. Because,
scary.
Nobody's explained it to you. You don't understand what's going on. Yes, of course, it can have an effect, not just on their, definitely it has an effect on their physical appearance, but it can also have an effect on our emotions because, I've got a couple of clients who are very young women who have always struggled from the onset of their periods. They have always struggled with their periods. They've always felt really in these particular cases, they've always felt really, really low at the time of their periods. Really quite severe, not being able, felt it really difficult to function, really difficult to integrate with family members, definitely couldn't go outside and get out into the world. And my big concern around that is, as I say, I think, there is a huge amount of over-medicalisation of the human condition anyway. But my huge concern over that is that the amount of young people who are being given medication for, not obviously it's not all of it, we can't, we can't say the same for everybody, but there is going to be probably quite a big group of young women, young girls, teenagers who are being medicated for an undiagnosed condition, if we're talking about severe PMT or PMDD. So that's, that's a real concern. But I think generally we kind of underplay the power of hormones.
Yeah. So it would be worth, again, it comes back to getting a bit informed and trying to get some understanding around it, and communication with your family and those around you.
Yeah.
Would you say that, just trying to actually just appreciating what you've just said, that, hormones are very, very powerful.
Exactly. Yeah. But I do think it's difficult because, again, we're coming from this place of this kind of huge void where the information should be. So amongst our medical professionals, amongst the parents, amongst the teenagers themselves, it's a very tricky balance to find, isn't it? And of course, teenagers are they're wanting to find their own way in the world. They're wanting to be independent. And sometimes it can be hard to go to your mum or your dad or your carer, whoever it is that sort of, has responsibility, is looking after you. It can sometimes be really hard to go and say, I don't feel right. But I don't understand what's happening to me. And if you think about it, there are so many women in their early 40s feeling like that. Imagine the pressure of that when you're 15, 16 or 17.
I'm going to put details of Diane's website on the show notes so you can find out more about her and her services, and do follow her on Instagram and Twitter too, because she puts up lots of information, and you also reply and support there quite a bit, don't you, Diane?
I do as much as I can.
As
lovely.
You can, yes. I'm just always really impressed with,
There's only 24 hours in the day and I have to sleep some of them.
Of course. And you can find out more about the Make Menopause Matter campaign as well, which was created by Diane to improve menopause education and awareness. So thank you so much, Diane, for coming and talking to us today about hormones. I mean, there's just so much there that will be light bulbs going off all over the country, I imagine. So thank you ever so much.
My pleasure, lovely. Nice to speak to you again.
Produced by Louise Daniels. Visit louise-daniels.com.